Hey everyone, so a while back I did a Wano arc analysis breaking down all the significant themes, ideas, and parallels of the arc so far as I saw it. But while that video is purely analysis talking about what the arc is actually about, what Oda is doing with his characters, some of the substance of the story that readers might have missed, I don't actually go much into my personal feelings of how good the arc has been. What are its strengths? Where do I think it could be better? What would I rate it, etc. And right now it seems like we're going to get a bit of a divergence from the main story to focus on Odin. So I feel like this is a good checkpoint to look back and review the arc so far. So to start with, before getting into the story itself, there's two areas where I want to give Wano just major props. The first is visually. Manga is a visual medium, and while the story comes first, the art is still a really big factor to enjoyment. And man, I think Oda's really enjoying drawing this arc. I think for both Punk Hazard and Dressrosa, neither arc really lent itself to fantastic imagery, but I felt as though from Zou to Whole Cake Island there was a sort of steady progression in how much effort was putting into the aesthetic, and now that we're finally at Wano, the overall artwork, it's definitely stepped up, and I think we could all feel that from literally the moment we were dropped into this location. Like, I'm not going to go on too long about this. I think it's very apparent that Wano is the most picturesque island that we've ever been to. Everyone has noticed Oda experimenting with his usual style to make for some really awesome double-page spreads. And while Wano features some of the most well-drawn panels in the series, really beyond that, not even just in terms of how technically good the artwork is, just conceptually, a lot of the imagery we've gotten throughout the arc feels, very fantastical, very flavorful. Like, I just really like seeing this visual of the heroes in traditional Japanese garb riding across the plains on a mythical creature while being chased by an evil spirit. I like seeing the sky splitting over this demon's lair, and even on a smaller level, stuff like Yasuie on the stand with the sakura petals coming down, or Zoro facing Yukimaru on a snowy bridge. It has been just a very visually enjoyable arc to read, from everything from the big striking panels to general scenery and atmosphere. And I do think that all does add something to the reading experience that I do think should be acknowledged. I will say that I feel like it has been lacking a little in terms of good character design, which feels especially apparent coming off the back of Whole Cake Island, since I felt like that arc set an extremely high bar in this category. Not that there haven't been some really cool designs, and it looks like we have some more great designs incoming, but in general, I feel like there's been a bit of a dip in this category since Whole Cake. And for the record, I'm not saying that all characters have to look cool or badass. Characters can look goofy while still being distinct and memorable. I just don't think Oda has really been flexing his creative muscles with the ones we've seen so far. There have been some pleasant surprises, like the Oniba Wanshu, and Otsuru is one of the most unique female designs we've ever had. But overall, I'd say that there were a few times that I expected more than we got in this design department. Like, after all that hype around Kawamatsu's appearance, like, what does he look like? Most of us had guessed that he was a kappa, so he was pretty much what you would expect, a swordsman kappa to look like in theory on paper. And after all that hype about Komurasaki, I feel like Oda didn't put in the same level of effort to differentiate her look from the average female as he did with someone like Hancock, who he had similarly hyped. And to be clear, I'm not saying that any of these are bad designs, just that I know that Oda can do more. But still, designs aside, Wano has been visually maybe the best arc in One Piece overall. The other category I want to discuss quickly before getting into the story is the world building. One Piece gets a lot of praise for its world building, how all the nations and islands connect, and how even within an island, like a given island, there's its own culture, its own regions, its own history, etc. But I think out of all the locations we've visited so far, Wano is easily the most fleshed out internal world, which is fitting, since this is an ancient, large, isolationist country. The land of Wano really is its own miniature world, split into various distinct regions connected by their own ports and bridges, and even within one region like Kuri, we have Amigasa Village, Leftover Town, Okobore Town, Odin's Castle, Itachi Port, and so on. And though we haven't spent so much time in the other regions just yet, we have already started to see that each region has its own unique history, its own culture, and its own traditions. This is all before even starting Odin's backstory, which should give us a lot more insight. And there's so much small stuff, like Wano has its own newspapers, telling only Wano-specific news. There are Wano fire departments, sumo wrestling competitions, there's a pleasure district, an underlying Yakuza system that runs the flower capital. And going off of that, in terms of governance, we learned that, Orochi rules the mainland with Kyoshiro as the Yakuza head under him, enforcing his rule in the flower capital, while the other regions seem to be run by Kaido's calamities. But in the past, the shogun ruled the flower capital with 5 daimyos ruling the other regions, all supported by a large Yakuza system with, 5 Yakuza heads and Boss Hyogoro at the center, and like a lot of little stuff like that about the structure of governance, and even beyond that, there are certain small technologies unique to Wano. The Smale system is the first significantly different variation we've seen of Denden Mushi's. We've seen small variations, but this is the first big one, I'd say. And similarly, this is the first arc where, Sea Stone is so widely available to be used in never-before-seen ways. So overall, I'd say the Wano imagery, the world, well done by the standards of any arc in the series. Now for the story itself. I think it's important for me to start off and acknowledge the issue that a lot of people have had with it, which is the pacing. Now, I will always say that for weekly manga, you can't really make judgments on the pacing till you're able to go back and reread it, because I think you can have a beautiful story that flows really well when read continuously, but it becomes choppy and dull when it's forced to be broken up into 100 tiny pieces that can only be digested like one at a time once a week. So I think pacing needs to be judged when, like, in its totality. That being said, I have read Wano weekly and I have reread it all in one go. Even on reread, the pacing isn't great. It's definitely better, but I can still feel the issues. Act 2 had this weird combination of being too fast-paced and too slow-paced at the same time. What I mean by that is that on the one hand, Oda has, he's an absolutely massive story to tell here. There's a tremendous amount of characters and a tremendous amount of moving parts. For such a big story, there has to be a lot of setup before we can get to the actual meat of the conflict. But because there's so much setup required, characters to introduce, exposition to cover, it means it's naturally going to take a lot longer to get to the action of the arc. And so then the second problem develops where because it's going to take so long to get to the action, Oda likely feels some level of pressure to, move things along as quickly as possible. And this basically results in this weird pacing where it feels like it's taking a long time to actually get to the big conflict, but at the same time it feels like the chapter-to-chapter pacing is too fast, since Oda is trying to cover as much as he can in a given chapter. So here's what I think a lot of us started to notice happening, which was Oda basically clipping down storylines as much as he could to get down to the only the most relevant moments of each story's plot, and then trying to make sure he fit in bits from as many storylines as he could in a given chapter. So basically, in a given storyline, we are now only getting the most relevant scenes and kind of skipping a lot of the in-between stuff. And then in a given chapter, we are jumping between, as many storylines as possible. So even those relevant scenes from each storyline are now only getting, 6 to 7 pages apiece. And then there's a lot of small instances where the reader can feel, this happening that just adds up over time. For example, I would bet that the initial plan for beginning the Zoro-Yasuie relationship was to have a scene where Zoro saved Yasuie from some Yakuza thugs. But if Oda was pressed for time, he may have decided to simply cut it down to 2 pages where he just tells us that this incident occurred, so as to more quickly move us along to the more important plot point of introducing Ebisu Town without sucking up too much chapter space. And again, this is really small. I don't care too much that we didn't see this scene, but it's the sense that this is adding up bit by bit over time. Did we need to see Sanjay versus Page 1 in its entirety? No. Did we need to see kids escape? No. Did we need to see Brook discovering a poneglyph? No, but it's just that the gradual repeated feeling that small events that could have been interesting to see, that we would usually expect to see, are being skimmed over for time that ultimately make Act 2's pacing too fast. And where it actually gets kind of bad is, notably bad, is a scene like this, where I personally feel it was very important for us to have seen the full drama of this scene play out from start to finish. Just dropping us in on a serious internal conflict that the Alliance is having without showing us the beginning or the end isn't effective. That's the sort of scene that really deserves time. It should have been close to a full chapter, because if you're showing this sort of conflict between allies, it's not enough to just briefly hear what the issue is. The actual words that start the conflict are really important to draw us in so that we can feel the tension rise and then break. Like Luffy and Usopp arguing over Mary is a great example of Oda doing this perfectly. And I know that's a terribly unfair example because, that was one of the pivotal moments of the entire arc, whereas Law and Shinobu is going to be relatively minor in importance overall. I'm not saying this scene should have been able to make us feel the same thing as that scene. But the point is just that Oda could have made us at least feel something here instead of, nothing or not much. And while the stakes of the conflict were minor, the underlying message seemed to still be extremely important for the story going forward, which is why I feel like we shouldn't have just gotten this final message through flashback. it would have carried a lot more weight if it had come, at the conclusion of a heated scene. And most importantly, this message and the attitude is really important for Law's character, since the whole point is that when we first met him, the big worry was that Law was an untrustworthy guy who seemed like he would betray them. But the more we got to know him, the more we realized that he is the one placing a great deal of trust in the Straw Hats. And now he is the one who is actually championing the importance of, trust and faith in one's friends above all else in the Alliance. All of that should be communicated as clearly as possible so we understand the idea behind Law's character and his, what his role is in this arc, or what he's kind of championing. It felt to me like this easily could and should have been a much more dramatic scene if it had played out from start to finish, but because Oda was likely pressed for time, he had to settle by just writing just enough pages of the scene to establish that this conflict happened. So basically, for me, everything else was small stuff that kind of added up, but this was the one standout example of poor pacing in this arc so far. On the other hand, as I've said, rereading it did improve the overall experience in terms of pacing, because the other scene that felt too fast-paced to me when I first read it weekly was the chapter where Luffy went up against Big Mom, and then was chased around Udon by Big Mom, and then Big Mom was attacked by Queen, then Queen captured Big Mom and took her to Onigashima. That seemed like it was too much for one chapter in the week that I read it. But on reread, you're not really thinking about when the chapters are, starting and stopping. Everything's just moving, and so it didn't actually feel that rushed the second time around. It was just a natural sequence of events that happened to occur in the same 19-page span. And similarly, one big thing that I felt improved, improved on reread, was the overall plight of Wano feels much more vivid. When you're getting bits and pieces of it split up over many weeks, you understand that they're bad factories, the water's poison, people are really poor, they're hungry, and all that stuff. But at the same time, there's way more important stuff going on in the plot that we're more focused on. So that kind of turns all that suffering stuff into just, it becomes background white noise. But when you're reading it all in one go, you do get a more constant sense of, wow, this place is messed up, because you can feel the flow of ideas a little better. Like, for instance, the chapter introducing how sad and pathetic Ibisu Town is, that's coming right off the back of a chapter showing the extravagant excess of Orochi's luxurious lifestyle in the Flower Capital. That sort of thing doesn't work as well split up over multiple weeks, but it does hit you a little harder when you're reading a continuous narrative and you can immediately pick up on that juxtaposition. So in general, while I think the pacing is a little too fast, read all in one go, it feels smoother, it doesn't really feel that choppy. It more so, if I had to describe it, it more so feels like you get the sense there's generally a lot happening all across this island, and we're getting to kind of zoom into various storylines to see, okay, what's been happening over here? Interesting. Okay, now what's been happening over here? Interesting, and so on. And we can pick up on the fact that certain pieces have moved since we last checked in on them, that kind of gives us a heads up of what sort of scene we might be dropping into the next time we zoom into that storyline. Again, the only time it feels problematic are the few times when it does feel like we might have missed a scene that we wanted to see, or when it feels like we didn't get to spend quite enough time on a certain scene because we have to jump to something else. That being said, I think at the end of the day, Oda should have just taken as much time. The simple solution, he should have just taken as much time as he needed. I would rather it have taken much longer to get to the main action of Act 3 than him try to speed up Act 2. I get that as a mangaka, you have to find ways to, it's part of your job. You have to find ways to generate excitement every week. But in an ideal world, he would be able to let the story take as long as it needs to take and, spend as much time on simple exposition as necessary. And even though the storyline, jumping around felt mostly fine on reread, my favorite chapters of this arc were still the single scene chapters, meaning chapters where for almost 19 pages we stayed in one storyline focusing on one scene. I'm speaking mostly on Act 2 here, since obviously Act 1 was basically all just, that was one storyline. My overall opinion of Act 2 is positive, since the strong moments, the single scene chapters that we got, were really, really good in my opinion. Early on, that stuff so we had the Shogun Palace conflict, the Zoro versus Kawamatsu, both of which were solid chapters. Kamazo. But I really think Oda hit his stride towards the end with Yasue's death onwards. And Oda loves setting things up like this, where he builds to a point where he can then fire off a series of really, big, surprising chapters back to back to back. I think we got a mini run of this in Act 2 from chapters 942 to 944. So I'll start with Yasue's death, one of my favorite points in the arc. At the most basic level, I think 942 was a very well-directed chapter by One Piece standards. Yasue being put up on a stand made for some really nice sweeping shots, as he called out, across the Flower Capital. And as his speech continued, the energy of the chapter kept increasing as there was more and more movement, kind of a frenzied feeling as the crowds of Ebisu Town became more and more emotional, pushing through to get to Yasuie, while at the same time Orochi was charging across the capital towards him. Of course, we had a lot of intense close-ups, and I love Yasu's final expression, which is one of those, I'd call them One Piece exclusive expressions, where it's this interesting combination of, an exaggerated clown-like expression somehow combined with this very real pain. I really like the actual panels of Yasu's death as well, especially where he's dead on the ground and the circular framing of the fence around him kind of feels like a spotlight on someone who just finished giving a dramatic speech. And of course the moment after his death where there's panels and panels of people just breaking down into this bizarre, laughing, crying delirium, that was just a cherry on top. And I understand that we didn't really know Yasuie well. Again, it helps when binge reading, where your memory of what's going on with each character is a little more clear. Like, when I was rereading and leading up to Yasu's death, seeing these scenes of him looking at the paper and saying, if only we could pretend it was all a lie, and then seeing him cheerfully interact with the townspeople one last time before heading off to sacrificing himself, knowing that he had already made up his mind to do so and never letting on about it or ever dropping his bright persona, that all does add something to the effect of this scene, because you have those previous scenes more fresh in your mind leading up to that moment. But beyond that, for me, at the time I read it, it didn't really matter that I didn't know Yasuie that well. In fact, I felt like the chapter was so good precisely because I hadn't felt anything for Yasuie up till this point. To me, what made this chapter great is that you could never have read One Piece at all and simply have been dropped in on this chapter, and still you get this story where you realize there once was a great, respected man who lost everything, who has fallen to the point that he's become a shell of his former self, a comical beggar figure, and now he's giving up the only thing he has left, his life, just to create a small chance at a better hope for the future of his people, and the way in which he's choosing to sacrifice his life, by pretending that his final act is just a giant prank, is simultaneously destroying his reputation among the people of Wano. Basically, he's willingly choosing to be remembered by everyone as a joke, rather than as the noble martyr that he is. To me, that's a tragedy in 20 pages. I don't need any prior context to read this short story of Yasuie and feel that something tragically wrong has happened in the moment that he was gunned down. To be clear, it's not like this death really broke me up or made me super emotional or anything. It's not like I felt like I was reading Robin's backstory. Again, I was not that attached to the character, but it did leave me with some sense of tragedy that I would never have expected this character to have made me feel. Basically, this isn't really, again, not supposed to be like Ace's or Whitebeard's death. This is just the death of a minor character partway through the second act of a 5-act arc. So view it through that lens. Really, to me, what's impressive is the fact that Oda is so often able to take characters who seem simple or minor and then rapidly change our perspective on who they are. It's the ability to suddenly make us feel something for a character that we probably never thought we would think much of. And more importantly, I think, is how Yasu's death was the catalyst for a shift in our understanding of the overall tragedy of Wano. Like, up to this point, we'd gotten lots of bits and pieces of how bad life in Wano is, but to start to really get an idea of just how far this nation has fallen, Oda deliberately used a seemingly insignificant character, someone who, fit right in with the many poor, malnourished citizens of Wano just trying to get by, and to start pulling back the curtain on how bad Wano really is, Oda reveals that Yasuie is not in fact just a jolly, cheerful minor character, but rather a noble, respected lord who has fallen this low. And from his speech, the tone is set that, from this moment on, we're going to start seeing, in general, how far Wano has fallen. What made these 20 years such hell, right? And this segues perfectly into the Smile reveal. We've already seen how tragic it is that the people of this town are living, the worst possible life already, barely scraping by, struggling for just a drink of water, etc., etc., but at least they're able to smile and maintain this admirable philosophy of always laughing in the face of misfortune. So following the chapter of Yasu's death, we get this nice, say, 1-2 punch where the very next chapter it's revealed that this philosophy, even this philosophy, was completely hollow this entire time, that the one good thing they have going for them is in fact not only fake, but rather the ultimate example of how they have been robbed of more than one could possibly imagine, not just food, not just water, but even the ability to express their suffering. And I think in general the Smile concept and how Oda worked it into the story was pretty creative. Like, in the first place, the idea of artificially made devil fruits, that's interesting, but the idea of artificially made devil fruits that have a 1 in 10 chance of working and a 90% chance of this inhuman side effect where you lose the ability to express any emotion other than laughter is extra interesting. And then on top of that, it's the reveal that this mysterious hierarchy of the beast pirates, of the waiters, the gifters, the pleasures, that all revolved around this fruit. That was really cool to me. And then the reveal of just how twisted Orochi is to have fed the people of Ibisu Town these defective smile fruits just to make the flower capital seem more perfect, and the reveal that the people of Ibisu Town had to knowingly continue to eat these smile fruits just to survive, that really adds a whole new layer to Wano's messed up situation, at least for me. And really the most important point is the fact that the smile situation with Ibisu Town, this is all a very literal representation of an idea that Oda tries to get across about, the entire One Piece world in general through as many arcs as he can, that there is great tragedy, hidden everywhere, often in plain sight. And even though the world may seem bright on the surface, that's simply a facade that those in power manufacture. And of course, the foreshadowing leading up to this idea was really strong. The true nature of smile is sad. There is sad beneath the smile, etc. Thinking about how that applies to the story as a whole, etc. To me, that's all just really clever long-term storytelling. So that was a really cool chapter, in my opinion, and it's followed by an even crazier reveal that even Killer, one of the supernovas, has been broken and made a victim of the smile fruits. And sure, we didn't know Killer well, but I think at this point most of us have seen enough of Kid to know that this guy is extremely similar to Luffy, that his journey mirrors Luffy's in a way. So now seeing Kid breaking down because of what happened to his partner does at least make the evils of the smile fruit feel more real. Like, we can imagine how Kid must be feeling seeing his right-hand man like this, because we can imagine how Luffy would feel if he saw Zoro like this. It also makes the evil of the smile fruit feel more relevant, as we realize that it's not just a problem specific to Ibisu Town. Characters that we know could become victims as well, so, really good all around. 942 to 944, I love that run of chapters. I won't say I loved Big Mom's bit in the prison as much, but after that I really love the scene where Luffy gives the speech to the guards. I talk about that at length in my Wano arc analysis, so I'm not going to repeat it here. Then Ashura Doji backstory deserved its own chapter, or at least more than just a few pages in my opinion, because even in those few pages, I feel like it did a good job capturing this proud mentality of, the strong-spirited people of Wano, a nation of reckless and fearless warriors who have to slowly grow old, waiting and waiting for a battle they aren't sure will ever come, till eventually they can't wait any longer and just take resolve in what they've learned since childhood to foolishly run off to their deaths. That to me was a really cool backstory idea, and even from what little we saw, I did love the panel of Ashura Doji begging them to come back, but really, in general, I wanted more. At the very least, Oda gave us a full flashback chapter for Kawamatsu, for instance, which wasn't really designed to be emotional like Ashura's, but was more so a cool little Aesop's Fable type story about loyalty that I really enjoyed. Like, I just really enjoyed the way the story was told. First, seeing how loyal Kawamatsu is to his master's mission. Then seeing him gain the trust of this fox who begins to help him with that mission. And then finally, after Kawamatsu disappears for 13 years and comes back, wondering what happened to the fox, we get this little twist that makes us realize how intensely loyal the fox has remained to his own master's mission in turn. So, yeah, just really like that one chapter Aesop's Fable type story. Those were probably my favorite parts of Wano, all stacked towards the end of Act 2, which makes my overall impression of it pretty positive. Two worst parts, I'd say, were the Hiyori twist. Don't even know what to say about this. This was the ultimate example, probably, of Oda having to pace out the story so that he's moving everything along at a good pace while still having to find cliffhangers every 19 pages. He never even tried to hide Hiyori's identity from the start. No one would have minded, I think, as much if this reveal wasn't done as a cliffhanger to the chapter, but the fact that it was made a cliffhanger does stick out more as like a low point of the weekly reading experience. Something I couldn't forget about even when I was rereading. Second point, the bigger point for me, is Big Mom's amnesia. I really, really, really don't like amnesia in stories. Didn't like it with Sabo, don't like it here. I understand the defense that Big Mom has technically shown memory issues before during her eating rampages. I understand the defense that maybe this is important down the line for her character, this Olin persona that was uncovered. Even if I can logically accept those defenses, I still personally don't like amnesia in storytelling, and I especially don't like the fact that, in this case, it was introduced so casually. Devil Fruit users go underwater all the time without anything like this happening. If Oda wanted to show that this was a more extreme experience than usual, or that Big Mom got really messed up by the whirlpool, I think he should have spared a couple extra panels to show that, because to me it felt like a huge jump from this character went underwater to this character literally forgot her memories. Those are my favorite parts. Those are my least favorite parts. I think lastly, I'll address a common criticism I think some people have, which is, lack of emotional investment. that's just a hard one to argue as right or wrong. Either you feel something as this end of Act 2 narration begins, as I personally did, or you don't. If we want to get into more specific reasons as to why people may feel this way, my feeling is it comes down to two things. One, we're invested in the Straw Hats, but it feels like they are not that emotionally invested in the arc. And two, the Scabbards are emotionally invested in the arc, but we don't feel that invested in them. Right? So kind of reverse problems on both ends. From the Straw Hats end, I think obviously the Straw Hats have been untroubled in Wano for the most part. I think the most angry we saw any of them get was when Zoro saw an acquaintance die, and then really briefly during Luffy versus Kaido. But to me, it's just not really criticism to me, because it's clear Oda's not really trying to develop the Straw Hats' emotional intensity yet. Like, simple comparison, look at the controversial arc Whole Cake Island. There it was clear what point Oda was trying to make the reader feel heavily emotionally invested in the Straw Hat stories, and the points when Oda was ramping up the Straw Hat's own level of emotion. And whether Oda succeeded at those points is probably what made a reader enjoy Whole Cake Island or not, right? But the point is, Oda hasn't even been trying to do that yet in Wano so far. We're just clearly not there yet. So once we are at that stage of the story, then I start to evaluate, okay, is Oda successfully hitting me in the feels with this stuff, or is this failing to do anything for me? It's not a negative, it's not a positive. I'm just not even rating him on that yet. And sure, you could say that, well, every other arc gets to this point faster. And sure, some arcs are heavier very early on, like Water 7. Other arcs take till about the halfway point to have a serious tone shift for the crew, like Alabasta. Wano is, as I've explained in past videos, clearly set up to be a much, much longer narrative than ever before, and it clearly has a much slower build-up phase than any arc before. So when Oda gets to the meat of the arc and then starts going try-hard with the Straw Hats, I'll judge him on that. Now, it's possible we get to the main conflict and we feel like Oda isn't able to successfully draw us into the Straw Hat struggles because he should have spent more time on them in Act 2. Then this all becomes a criticism. Right now, it seems like he just didn't think it fit for them to be in this state for 2 straight weeks in Wano. Now, on the other hand, we also have the Scabbards who are emotionally invested, but we don't have that strong of a personal connection with them yet, or at least I think most of us don't just yet. And here to a degree, I would agree that yes, I've grown to personally like the Scabbards more than I did initially, but I agree that it's hard to really, really feel for them just yet, because we do need the story of Oden to be able to truly empathize with what this whole mission means for them. But in general, that's just how it goes for all One Piece arcs. We see and hear about characters' motivations, we observe how deeply they care about something, but for a long time that their full story remains a sort of question mark for us, and we don't truly understand why they feel and act the way they do, until Oda finds the perfect moment to give us that crucial missing piece, which suddenly gives us a new perspective on everything we've seen of them so far. So I don't really know what to say here, other than this is just how One Piece works. If you've liked any backstory in the series ever, then this is the formula Oda uses, and to me it's been pretty amazing so far. So yeah, we haven't had a full inside look into the Scabbard story yet, but now Oda's starting to ramp up the emotion on their end, so naturally he's giving us their backstory to get us invested as well, and I think what is the right time. So, whether it's a good backstory or bad, I guess we'll see. But yeah, I don't have much more to say on the emotional investment in general, other than some stories take longer to build to the drama than other stories. That's it. So all that being said, overall I'd give Wano so far an 8 out of 10. It would be a 9 out of 10 for me if Oda took more time with it and hadn't rushed the pacing at parts. So I'd take 1 point off for the pacing, and it can't be a 10 out of 10 for me yet because there have yet to be any classic moments in my opinion. Like I personally need to see something like an I Wanna Live or a Whitebeard death or something like that, something that really affects me. So 10 out of 10 has to be really special to me. So that's all for this video. If you enjoyed, then definitely like, share, and subscribe. And you can join my Patreon for chapter reviews and extended thoughts podcast.